and you have to kind of conspire with them or collude with them in order to get them to do anything. So basically I'm interested in this, and partly because it just introduced like this interesting counter spin on, you know, think of tables and chairs and stuff like that as evidence of plots, of like ingenuity that has gone on in this kind of subversive insurrectionary way to kind of like trick these materials into the forms that they are, which is all very interesting. But it also opens up like a whole other vista, I think, about what we think we're doing when we're designing and the way that we're initiating, well, it feels personally like, you know, on a personal level, that you're kind of initiating some new thing through a creative process, but in fact you're just acting as a kind of plot twist, and you're getting further embroiled in all these mechanisms that you don't fully understand. You don't need to understand to do what you do, but nonetheless are kind of still there and have their own agendas. Obvious examples of this being, you know, kind of the fate of the Industrial Revolution, with enormous amounts of carbon being put into the atmosphere and so on. These kind of hidden plot twists were always there. The processes were in motion, but we weren't aware of them. And then there's a kind of counter twist when you realise actually this is what's happening, and you need to go back and retract the evidence in this fragmented kind of way and synthesise it into some kind of plot and try to act back on it again, which obviously goes up to a very big scope, which is why I think I'll talk to Paul now about it, because he's gone to quite large scale in this project.
Yeah, thanks for the little lead in there. So,
link.
So I'll talk about all of these diagrams and this kind of like beginnings of a Yarnwork that's on the wall there. In 2013, I was invited to go to Donetsk on a residency as an artist, Donetsk in Ukraine. And kind of thought it would be a really good place to try and unpick this thing that Robin talked about, so sort of like an artist approaching a site, and finding a way to make a work that's about the site but doesn't fall into the trope of the site-specific work. Donetsk is a pretty interesting city. Obviously it's got huge troubles at the moment, which is very sad, and the work that I'm making is it's becoming about that at the moment. So how can you make an artwork about a site that doesn't sort of fall into the trope of the site specific? So some previous work which I've done with Robin in Cornwall was like looking at the mining landscape of Cornwall in England, and sort of like or revealing the subplots, I guess, or the main plots of that industrial landscape, which is all about copper and tin mining. And there's kind of like we devised this this tour where we went around the landscape with a group of invited artists and curators for a convention, and we sort of tried to explain this plot, which of kind of geological contingency, which was playing out and led to the existence of the copper and the tin in that place, which then led to the like hugely influential industrial boom there. So that I guess sort of informed this work, which was when I decided to try and chart the history of the city of Donetsk in a timeline, but start with the Big Bang. So the timeline ended up being 136 meters long. So this is like a scale section of it here. This is just one small part of it. And then in the very last section of the timeline, there's a change of scale, because I wanted to then sort of like chart the Big Bang. They've got stellar nucleosynthesis there, where the iron and the calcium and the carbon and the oxygen are formed. So basically all of these, the lines here each colour represents a different element, which then becomes later on very significant for the existence of Donetsk, because Donetsk is an iron town, it's a steel town, so it's all about coal and steel. So these are the elements kind of like going through time in a material continuum. And there's all of these places where you get these kind of little, I guess you could describe them as plots, that Yeah, so I guess that it really is mostly about trying to locate trying to understand the local conditions in the context of the universal, and it's also about, in the case of this work, about time, because when the human appears at the end of the timeline, the whole of human civilization occupies 0.1 of a millimeter at this scale. So the universe forms over 136 meters, and then the human appears. Human consciousness, human civilization appears in the last 0.1 millimeter. But somehow it's connected with what Benedict was talking about, complicity with materials, because it's almost like that city had to be there because the materials are there. So it has there's this conspiracy with the materials of the city, which the human gets kind of drawn into and implicated in. Then, of course, the more recent the city was founded by this Welsh guy, which is pretty strange, like a British guy, under commission from the Russian Tsar, and that was all to do with the military-industrial complex and the failure of the Russian army in the Crimean War in the 1850s. So there's another plot there, there's a whole other sort of conspiracy and a whole set of local events which kind of reach down and somehow cut into this line of material contingency. So John Hughes, the guy who founded the city, was commissioned to produce iron for the Industrial Revolution in the Russian Empire. Then the city, of course, became expanded hugely in the Soviet times and became one of Stalin's favorite cities because it was completely new, founded in 1869, didn't have any cultural base, was made of all sorts of different disenfranchised and people from all over the Soviet Union, which were brought to that one place as workers. And then the city was then destroyed in the iron factory which John Hughes built was destroyed during the Soviet Revolution. Then it was destroyed again during the Civil War, and then it was destroyed again during the Second World War, twice actually during the Second World War, once by the Russians as they did the scorched earth policy where they destroyed all of their industrial mechanisms so that the Third Reich couldn't get them, and then when the Third Reich came they tried to force everyone to rebuild them, which was partially successful, and then so like this story of Donetsk is incredibly traumatic, and it just goes on and on and on, and with all of these little plots that affect it. And of course now at the moment there's another plot going on. Well, I guess this is all another very important plot is the 90s and the rise of the Donetsk clans and the mafia from the east of Ukraine, which then became the ruling force in Ukraine, which Yanukovych, who was deposed last year, was the head of the Donetsk clans, the business clans. So within that little story, you've got another whole Yarnwork that could happen with all of the different protagonists, all the different gang leaders, the murders, the locations, the different payoffs and private deals and protection rackets going on. And now, in the last 18 months, what's happened, what's unfolding and still unfolds every day is becoming quite interesting for this particular work, because obviously it means that this work can't be finished yet. And it also presents a situation which Benedict was describing, where the plot, I've got this real sense at the moment that what's happening in eastern Ukraine is like is happening in real time. You've got the plotter and you've got the plotted or the plotty or whatever, and the yarn work, if it could be made, is something that sort of exists in the middle, and you've got this reflection with the West on one side and well, I mean, I hasten to say the West, I don't want, like, you've basically got Putin on one side and a sort of a ragtaggle assembly of people who are trying to think about it but don't really know what's going on and haven't really understood the implications of that situation yet. NATO and the US and the EU, and it's all happening in real time. And there's it's like a play being written, and that's kind of quite strange. And then I was beginning to think about that and how then the yarn work could be useful and is useful in terms of propaganda and generating these stories through, like, you've got a whole, if you have all of the notions, you've got all of the cards, the different parts of the plot laid out in front of you, and then you can just draw your own line through it and tell one completely different story. Then if you start at another point and draw a different line, you'll come up with something completely different, and that's kind of what's happening there, I think.
I think that kind of collusion between adversarial forces is a really interesting part of the whole plot thing, actually. I mean, and it kind of goes all the way down, as you're describing. So, like, I mean, one of the most compelling writers on geometry, I think it's a guy called Giuseppe Longo, who you know, who is a biologist a mathematical biologist, who wrote a book called Mathematics and the Natural Sciences, and part of which he talks about the origins of geometry and predation. And predation only emerged as like a specific kind of survival strategy in the Cambrian, along with backbones and various other, kind of staple platforms for the biosphere now. But Longo talks about the initial origin of the idea of the widthless line, like the abstract line, between 2 points. And when you're a predator and you're hunting prey, you have to intercept that prey, not where it currently is, but where it's going to be by the time you reach it. So you have to extrapolate its trajectory. And as soon as this begins to happen, then prey animals start developing defensive strategies, and the kind of neural systems begin to echo each other, and there's like an escalation, like born of antagonism, but like it also sophisticates kind of both sides, and they become entirely dependent on each other because they're the creatures that we're talking about in this context are like totally wired to interact with each other, even if it's in a way that's not kind of collaborative in the normal sense. And that's one of the things I really like in your work. It's this sense of just kind of like strata, basically, operating at different scales. But it's almost like the coal and the iron ore itself is kind of like sophisticating the conspiratorial, mafia-based politics and that kind of thing. To what end? That's kind of.
Yeah. That was what we decided earlier on in the time, wasn't it? That this is really all about a question of scale.
Yeah, scale's very important, I think. And the question of navigating between scales, and that is linked to, I think, for me, that's linked to the bond between philosophy and madness, which is something I was thinking about in terms of this Yarnwork. Obviously, a detective story is about thinking and investigating and finding or constructing the truth. So it's been really appealing to philosophers over the years. Many philosophers have expressed a preference for crime fiction and plot-driven fiction because it kind of models the process of thinking. But what's interesting about the Yarnwork, and what you'll find in some of the films in which it features, is it's always kind of bordering on the edge of paranoia, conspiracy mania, and madness. And I think that's something that it has in common with philosophy, because, if you're trying to think about things in the world at the most general level, if you're trying to kind of unify experience under a set of principles, then you tend to lose detail, you tend to lose resolution. And I think for me, philosophically, the concept of plot, how I want to make it work, is to avoid a couple of very important traps in philosophy. The first one is a kind of universalism which eradicates a lot of the species of things and phenomena that we're familiar with. So, for instance, yes, we could say we're made of the same stuff as the stars, and therefore everything's stardust. Well, it doesn't get you very far in thinking about any of the levels of organisation in between the birth of the universe and the human being and all the things that we do. It kind of it's a kind of monism, which in one sense is kind of satisfying and has a kind of wow factor, but it doesn't really get you very far. And the other trap, I think, is a kind of what would you call it? A kind of magnanimous approach to the universe, where you say everything has its status. So, stardust is a thing, humans are a thing, planets are a thing, ducks are a thing, everything's a thing, and they all have equal rights. Well, that also doesn't help you to understand how these levels and stratifications of reality are connected, and it doesn't help you to get from one to the other. What it doesn't help you do is to navigate this plot twist where you start with a local site which seems to be kind of circumscribed and whole within itself, but then you find out that that was produced by wider plots, and then you get down to the next level and you find out, well, that was produced by something which is even broader. And which is, of course, that is the narrative of the thriller or the detective story. It always goes deeper. It always goes deeper. And in the best stories, like in The Bourne Identity, you get to the bottom of it and you find out that it was you all along. So this kind of twisting, ramified structure is something that's very hard to introduce, I think, into philosophy. And probably engineering is the place where you actually find it, that it's appreciated and that it's kind of a part of the vocabulary of the practice, because engineers have to deal with different scales of matter all the time. They can't just say, you know, a bridge is a bridge and a stick is a stick, and the two things are the same kind of thing. You have to deal with the metal on a molecular level, on a level of kind of tens of meters long, and on a level of the whole bridge. So you have to navigate between these different layers. So that's one of the things that I kind of am looking to this concept of plot to do. There was one other thing that I was going to respond to there, but I can't remember what it was.
Can't help you, sorry.
I think for me one of the interesting things about it is it also links the concept of plot links descriptive activity to construction in a very interesting way, rather than kind of ghettoizing theory and practice into separate things. There's, I mean, as you see in the kind of classic thriller setup of the detective and the criminal and the Yarnwork and that sort of thing, it's like the detective is engaged on an attempt to understand the plot and its unfolding, but precisely in order to induce a twist in it from the adversary's point of view. And I mean, in relation to the levels, I mean, I guess if you look at something like Chris Nolan's Inception, does that in such a beautifully literal way, when you have a dream within a dream within a dream, I think within a dream as well, and then the top level might be a dream as well, but each one, as you go down, is 10 times slower, and they orchestrate. I mean, he borrowed the phrase from an anime film with a suspiciously similar plot, but the phrase "the kick" an induced waking up moment that kind of ramifies down through the various levels and connects things.
That's a brilliant example of kind of what I was saying right at the beginning about, bringing other practices and other types of thought into philosophy, like the kick. But it's a brilliant concept. It's a concept that needs to be brought in and elaborated. There's a whole kind of framework of thinking about the world that's compressed into that idea.
And with this sort of genre fiction approach, I mean, it's kind of, because it is so intensely focused on modelling how people get things done. So it sort of always works on at least two levels. You have an actual plot, like a heist or a hijack or a murder spree or something, and then the way that is cut and presented in a fragmentary form is also like a further plot. You can pull out these really, really rich things. So there's something like the kick, or just the idea of the plot twist itself. But then also, the yarn work and the idea of being complicit in something that happens rather than consciously collaborating in it, and this kind of thing. And it feels like there's a whole portfolio of very stylized and exaggerated kind of everyday experiences, but nonetheless they're made so crisp and clear by being so stylized that you can kind of pull them out and explore, like, well, what's the actual status of this thing?
I think one of the things that we do in movies, it's kind of a collective dreaming, isn't it? So obviously we're kind of mythicizing and blowing up to huge proportions the way in which we think. So there's a kind of second remove there, which you can't take it too literally, and yet there is I think the ones that are kind of selected, so to speak, the ones that really work and that get reproduced and that get intensified, are the ones that really do tell us something about how we construct truth, about the kind of subject who gets things done, finds their way through to the next level of the plot, etc.
What do you think about this genre of the spy thriller? Because that's much more operating in real time, much more kind of how it went earlier on. You're describing like the twist, creating the twist, creating the plot as you're going along, and that's what espionage is about, isn't it? It's like in compared to like just thinking on very basic terms about detective thriller, which is about working out what's happened. The spy thriller is much more about things still happening.
Yeah, things are
being
moving
constructed,
all the time. Yeah,
and then that comes to like what you talk about traps.
Yeah.
And negotiating a continually evolving set of traps, which are being sort of set for you.
Yeah, because you get out of a trap and into another one. That's just, structure of the world.
One of the best things that happened when I was doing the podcast was when I was talking to Henry Turner, who wrote this fantastic book, The English Renaissance Stage, which, it's a lot wider than this, but in particular one of the chapters talks about this origin of the word plot and its relation to geometry and the way in which playwrights kind of understood themselves as belonging to an artisan class rather than necessarily to a literary tradition, or perhaps both together. But anyway, so we were talking about that for about an hour, and then at the end he suddenly kind of went into this great paean of praise to John le Carré, and John le Carré's masterful kind of way of balancing a plot on this single pivot point at the end of the novel. Which, I think it's an incredible craft, isn't it, to make that work. But I remembered what I was going to say before, which was about this thing about predation, because I remember a phrase that you used about this before, like when you've got a predator who needs to understand how the prey is going to act, who needs to understand something of their kind of inherent behaviour in order to subvert it, in order to catch them. So that's kind of like the first level of what would be a trap. That is, you need to look ahead at the behaviour of the prey and act in such a way as to steer its natural behaviour towards its doom. And you use this phrase, empathy without sentimentality, which I think also completely applies to this relationship between we keep coming back to this De Niro and Pacino in Heat, the cop and the criminal, who kind of have this empathy because they're in a sense they're kind of both outside of conventional society. They're both operating outside the law to a certain extent, and they're engaged with each other in this kind of intensification process. But it is this empathy without sentimentality. Yeah,
which is, especially in Western cultures, it's a sort of cliche of critiques of modernity. So, in an urban space, then people don't know their neighbours, and there's this sort of reprisal of I guess it's a Judeo-Christian thing, of that empathy and a sense of fellowship and putting yourself in someone else's shoes is a good thing and is the key to various problems of social atomization and so on. But there's quite another way to look at it as well, which is this is precisely what a detective chasing a criminal does, and vice versa. And there's a whole kind of counter history of that, of very closely trying to model what someone does is not, and put yourself in their shoes, literally kind of cognitively inhabit their vantage point in order to tell what they're going to do next. There's nothing imminently pleasant about that at all, and indeed quite the reverse, actually.
Well, this is where design meets kind of manipulative plotting, right? In that, so far as you described it, in order for me to be a good carpenter, I have to have a kind of empathy with the materials I'm working with. I need to know what the natural grain is and how to work with that in order to get the results I want. Now, when designers have tried to apply that approach to people, it usually is not very popular, right?
Well, it kind of, it's got an unusual history. So in the last couple of hundred years since the advent of the factory, it's the idea, if you say the phrase, kind of designing human behaviour, it tends to imply a certain set of associations, which is treating people as kind of generic, anonymous, as a kind of fungible resource to be deployed as you will, and this kind of thing. But before that, the kind of late 1700s, I guess, there was a different set of associations when you treated someone as a thing. especially as, I mean, if you look back at Descartes or whoever, and kind of mechanistic biology and the idea that animals are machines and we can understand them as machines, so that stuff is often pointed to as the beginning of the onset of the rot, you know, and the dehumanization of the world and stuff. But actually, at the time that those kinds of passages were being written, a complex machine that worked was a vanishingly rare and very desirable object. When you have to hand carve a gear set or something like that, this is not like a trivial feat. So especially in the origins of ballet and choreography and so on, you get people being described as machines as kind of the highest form of praise. I mean, they're able to do a very complicated thing over and over again absolutely perfectly. So there's a whole different range of associations, but in general, there's a very strong history of suspicions about designers extending what they do to human beings, which has gone through various seasons, I guess. So the Industrial Revolution, it means commodifying people thing. And then before that, the sense that, sort of prefiguring people's behaviour and creating situations in order to get them to do something as if it were of their own accord. Plotting, has been treated with a great deal of suspicion, rightfully so, but then at the same time, I mean, it's what parents do with kids all the time, isn't it? I mean, it's, and people do it to each other all the time. It's one of the reasons I ended up doing this PhD work on design, looking at these kinds of questions, is because I think we need a much more sophisticated view of what design is if we're to have like a realistic chance of assessing those things rather than condemning them and then doing them anyway, which...
Yeah, and I mean, what else would sociality be if not an extended form of predation?
That's a cheery thought.
Any questions, anybody? No? Maria, you've got a question, haven't you?
Yeah.
Thought so. Yeah.
Maybe approaches that you could use on developing this Donetsk work.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, just what are your ideas about proceeding further?
Well, we didn't actually. At one point, we talked about like coming up with like a formal list of symptoms, didn't we, of a plot? But we ended up, I think. We didn't get to that point. Could still be done, but maybe it's not necessary. So, but mainly, I mean, I guess that the breakthrough for me with this work is understanding how, as I described earlier, how very simply I can start to sort of focus on specific parts of the history of the city and show how they kind of reach down and cut into this strata. So I'm beginning to think of those much more as kind of like isolated yarnworks that could work visually. Like that one over there is kind of beginning to, that's a bit of a mix-up. It's kind of got bits of everything in there. But I've got an awful lot of material like that. I mean, masses of it, which are collected during the research when I was in Donetsk and have like found since. And I'm working with various historians and kind of like cultural theorists and people who know a lot about the kind of like whole post-Soviet period and the post-Soviet trauma and syndromes that go with all of that acting out in Ukraine. So there's lots of different elements which I think that if this... the other thing is I've realised that this work doesn't actually have to ever be finished and it doesn't have to actually exist. Originally it was going to be painted onto the wall in this art centre in Donetsk, and it was going to be a really big installation. It was going to be hell for whoever had to do it. So it would have involved a lot of volunteers and lots of like painting thin coloured lines on the wall and everything. And so whilst I've been here, I've been working on this purely digital version in Illustrator. So that's been really good. Now I can like print it out at any scale and just install it as on a long piece of paper, which means that I've begun to see that this work is probably never going to be finished for quite a lot of reasons. One, because it's just like too mental to to try and finish it, and the other one is that the story's still unfolding. So I begin. What's come out of this for me as an artist is to see that I could go from here to another place, like set this up with other influences around me, like Robin and Benedict have been this time, and sort of like just approach it afresh every time. And it can just be a work on paper, and it can always get added to, and different things can be drawn out of it. And that's quite liberating for me, because I was quite sort of like stuck on the idea of it being installed somewhere one day. So it's good. That's a good outcome for me, is to figure that out, and then understanding all of these different implications of the plot and is pretty useful.
I think when you were talking about the fact that you could kind of find these points on the timeline when there's this significant kind of slicing of the under continuum by what's happening on the top level, that's really interesting in relation to this question of site, because once you make this first move to kind of immerse site, the local site, into this universal continuum, then the next question is like how to get it back out again, really, and how to decide what is a singular or interesting site. And I keep going back to what A.L. Weisman was saying to me when I did the podcast with him, when he was talking about the fact that if you're looking at conflict, if you're looking at violence, you have to look at it in this multi-layered way. So there's an incident that happens, it's kind of like the local crime scene, but then there's also a kind of social fabric and an architectural fabric within which, whose forces have conspired to bring that violence to a head and to make something kind of explode at that point. And then there's also this slow violence going on beneath of political manipulations and maneuverings. And so this singular point is in a sense like the point at which all of these strata kind of line up to produce an explosion. And I think, a kick, exactly, right. So the identification, once you've kind of acknowledged that any site is already immersed in the universal, the question of kind of how to retract it again is really interesting. Sorry, there's one other thing I was going to say, which you were saying. We kind of started to work on a typology or a kind of set of general principles. One thing that we started talking about was this conspiracy physics, which was after I talked with Benedict, and he was talking about the difference between the plan and the plot. The fact that if you have a plan which is set out in advance, and you know what you're going to do, it's always vulnerable to plots, because plots don't work in that way. They have a different temporality, and plots can always invade plans. So plans are kind of prone to being infected and being mobilized and being swerved in a certain way by plots that come from outside. And then we started to think about so what these situations which seem to act like they seem to have a kind of gravitational pull on plots from elsewhere, like they seem to pull in other people's manipulative plots, and the situation in Ukraine would be one of these. And to start to think about, well, what is it about these situations which kind of attracts plots, which attracts the investment of these manipulative plots that are coming from elsewhere. These kind of chaotic situations in which agents can kind of see that they can draw a benefit from and turn it in their own direction.
Well, that in the case of Donetsk, of course, that's the military-industrial complex. The fact that the mineral resources were there to be extracted and invested in making the machines of war. And so that's why all of that trauma has been attracted, and all of those subplots have been attracted to that place. But that's obviously a result of the geological plot, the conspiracy between, as we were trying to work out in the work in Cornwall, the kind of like the hydroplutonic Kernode project, which is about the conspiracy of materials and the sun and the sort of the boiling molten core of the planet and the relationship between that and the water which formed the minerals. So
I found one of the interesting things about it, the massive improbability the sort of like far from equilibrium nature of plots when they're interesting. I mean, if you think about like oil, for instance, so you imagine you're a dinosaur 65 million years ago, and there's a funny light in the sky.
Yeah.
And then everything is everything as the world has been for 100 million years is completely incinerated or choked with ash or frozen. And swamps are crushed under millions of tons of pressure, and then like liquefied, and then the massively removed descendants of the little furry things that used to try and steal eggs out of your nest, like suck you out of the ground, put you through this incredibly complex thing, and then turn you into a component on the Voyager probe and launch you into deep space. I mean, that's kind of like, and this looked at in that way, like this is just like a palpable absurdity to the convergence of these plots. But that's almost like an index that there's been a kick where plots have intersected, is that there becomes something kind of captivating about it because it is not what normally happens. So there's kind of like a degree of novelty to it, or at least I guess for you as like an invested observer. And there's something really curious about that sort of like
But again, that's the scale again, isn't it?
Exactly.
But one of the other things that we were trying to figure out was like how, well, when you're investigating a plot of a yarn, like where do you know when to stop? And the other thing is what's significant and what isn't significant within a plot. Because I was just thinking about that in terms of, like, there's one little part over here, which is so this is John Hughes.
Subject is mobile.
Yeah, this is John Hughes, who founded the city of Donetsk, and he worked as a boy in this ironworks in South Wales in Britain, and he was just a worker. He wasn't trained. He was never trained his whole life. He was illiterate his whole life, even though he founded the biggest ironworks in Europe. He could never read and write, and it's like he had to walk when he was a boy, and he worked in this ironworks here. He had to walk from his tiny little like cottage where he lived with his family. He had to walk past this huge, you can't see it in this printout, but a huge castle where the owner of this ironworks lived on the hill, like overlooking this ironworks. It's like huge house, and he had to walk past it every day. And it's like, was that just the fact that he had to walk past that castle every day the thing that completely pushed him to become one of the biggest iron magnates in the whole of history? It's like what's the significant part? Where's the sort of like the kingpin that in that little plot? Is that really significant?
Where's
the
border between deduction and kind of fabulation? Because once you're in front of the yarnwork, the whole point of the yarnwork scene is that you need something else. There's a leap that you need to take. You're staring at this thing because you're waiting for this moment to happen. So it's always to do with what Peirce calls an abductive thinking rather than deductive thinking. And that's what happens in Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes isn't about deduction at all. It's not a logical deduction from the premises to the conclusion. It's an abduction. It's a hypothetical leap. So that's always what you're after. But how do you know whether it's significant or whether it's simply like a whimsical thing that you've noticed? And I think that comes back again to this question of site-specific art, and the fact that one often wonders when you see site-specific art, are you interested in the site or are you interested in yourself? And one often wonders of the commissioners of that art, are you interested in the site or are you interested in highlighting the method of this particular artist and applying it to this site? So a lot of artists have a very specific style, which is reliable, and you can hire them to come and do that here. So it's often, for me, I often think, is this really about the site? And I guess that's the whole question, is like, what does it mean for it to actually be about the site? And not about yourself as a kind of introspective subject who's a kind of free associating with things that they see in the site. And I think what you've done in the Donetsk work is really interesting because it's kind of taking it to completely the other extreme, which is just like working on a scale at which your own agency is absolutely, indifferent.
Yeah, but there still is room for me to make those kind of hypotheses, which no one else would. So there's still, but
But maybe
yeah,
that's
I often question whether this is an artwork or not, or whether it's actually just a completely crazy document or a history project. Or
one of the things, I mean, I think it's interesting about this, and relates to something we were talking about earlier than this session, was about the relationship of the plot to time, and not just as a scalar thing, but I mean, from my own point of view, I'm really interested in the link between forensics and design. So forensics reconstructs plots and design constructs plots, but actually as soon as you kind of start looking at that, then it begins to fall to pieces, and they become these kind of like imbricated kind of phenomena. And like here, I mean, you were saying that it's probably never finished. It's unfinishable. There's no natural termination point that wouldn't be arbitrary. Because it's continuing to unfold and so on, but also it will be subject to revision as well. I mean, no black matter, dark matter, you know, so there's some physical breakthrough about stellar nucleosynthesis, and then you'll need to kind of redraw that, and it will ramify all the way through the timeline. And that's, I mean, it's one of Reza Negrestani's kind of quotable things, I guess, is the revision and construction.
That's why I like
the past seems to change. If you have to change your view of the past in order to change the future, and vice versa. As the future does unexpected things, it revises your view of the past. So the plot kind of like runs all the way through that, but contains. You can find twists in the past that you didn't, that you weren't aware of.
That goes right back to the origins of, narrative fiction, right? Right back to Oedipus. That you have a moment where your entire identity, your entire past is completely revised. That's like the archetypal plot twist, isn't it?
Yeah, because a plot twist is a revision of the past and then an unknown future, and that's where it gets kind of its emotional thing from. But I mean, you write down there, you've got the Big Bang, and like talk about plot twists.
Yeah, quite.
No one saw that coming, did they?
Baryonic matter.
But this is a good thing that it goes back to your question earlier on, like what have I had out of this as an artist? Like finding that liberating, being in that liberated position now that I can just treat this as a paperwork that's always just going to go on and just can just grow and become more and more annotated, more and more kind of like bits crossed out. Now that's wrong, and this actually connects up to this, and like no, forget that. Let's add a bit more on here, and that's really nice because it can just be a case study of that kind of thinking then.
Because it's kind of a map of your understanding of Donetsk, which will continually evolve, and at some point you'll give up. So we'll die.
Maybe you just can change the scale again and just finish the entire story with just collapse of the universe.
Yeah, exactly. Because all this stuff, this is the first 0.001% of the universe before heat death.
This is diagram on the wall over there is about this. I think it's this one. This one here. This is like the universe from the Big Bang up to here, and then there's all of this other stuff that's going to happen.
Yeah.
In theory.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
Of course.
A loose set of associations, but obviously the empathy without sentiment is obviously like a really disturbing kind of thinking about when you're thinking about site specificity being I'm just interested in it because what I can do there. Of course this is self-interest. We can spin that around forever, I suppose, neoliberal, etc., etc. So I wonder where, and also when you were talking about, I was thinking about certain ideas of authorial position within that, because when you're talking about plots, it's almost like immediately one is able to spin out, get a certain distance to something.
Because it's an abstraction.
Right.
So
whereas one is still imbricated within it. So how does, particularly from design and forensics, this kind of dialogue you were talking about here, how does I'm thinking politically, I think, and I'm thinking, how does design function within the world politically, not as something which is working as on this premise of empathy without sentiment, but is something maybe, I'm thinking maybe of constructivists even, perhaps, where they had an idea of a certain revolutionary ideas of what design could function within society more, even with all the problems within that. But that wasn't something that was, more adhering to a kind of commercial thing. The fact that we can sell you what you want next, and we'll embed that want within advertising, public relations, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
That's simplification.
Finding ways to soak up overproduction and things like that, like Fordism and that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I guess the short and the sincere answer is, I mean, I have no idea, but but I think there's an imminent, from a designer's point of view, there's like an imminent logic to this. I wrote a piece for the Accelerationist Reader that Robin published last year, like a year ago, called Maximum Jailbreak, that attempted to have a go at something of this, which was the fact that, you mean, a really basic definition of freedom would be getting out of a trap. And there's a long history of people condemning trap makers for, you know, because, I mean, like Plato in the Laws talks about, like, if people are allowed to learn to make traps and to kind of use animals' own proclivities against them, then this will literally turn into political insubordination and revolution and so on. But one of the curious things about that is that the trap is very much a weapon of the weak. It's how you act in the environment if you can't master it directly. And you are yourself trapped by, you know, these other forces, and you have to understand the mechanism of those forces in order to be able to intervene within them. So in the Maximum Jailbreak thing, there's this really nice line from slaves in the 17th century French colonies who used to understand escaping as, we used to refer to it as stealing your own corpse. Because before you could escape, you would have to understand that you yourself were complicit, or, you know, like unconsciously colluding in the logic of the stuff that trapped you. So you would need to distance yourself from yourself in order to be able to actually unpick your own behaviour and this kind of thing. And in that essay, at least, I sort of tried to draw that out to kind of its maximum possible extension, which would be things like the space program and so on. That you see the world as a nest of traps at different scales, and if you start unpicking them, you know, you get yourself out of a trap, but then you still, you know, that doesn't make you free, that just makes you free in relation to something that was trapping you. So you could kind of, if you extend that sort of dynamic logic, then it goes up and up and up, which is why I've been so interested in the development of stuff like Nick Senachek and Alex Williams have sort of purloined the term accelerationism from a critical term to a positive one. But this like general sense that there are that there's kind of like an emergent aesthetic there, I guess, of kind of like, well, you don't actually precisely know what is good about something like Soylent. I don't know, Soylent, the food stuff, basically a bunch of computing science engineers just wrote down a list of everything the human body needs, ordered it from pharmaceutical supplies and turned it into a milkshake, and you know, which is incredibly cheap to produce. And it's kind of like, well, there will be plot twists in that particular narrative. There will be things that are missing that aren't recognised in contemporary nutrition, or at least that these guys weren't aware of, and so on. But nonetheless, there's kind of like this determined effort to kind of expand the sphere of human possibility. And I don't mind saying human possibility as well, because I mean, a lot of the plot stuff actually quite sophisticatedly articulates, you know, how humans are complicit with anonymous materials, as Rez has called them, and this sort of thing. But at the same time, it's kind of like, well, we are us, and I think it's sort of a cheap shot to wriggle out of that and say kind of like, but are we the most important thing? It's kind of like, well, you know, let's have that conversation when your kid's got a cough that doesn't go away or something, you know. It's like, I think there's a certain just kind of like integrity to saying like, well, yeah, we are actually, you know, pretty interesting actors in the world, and as Robin was saying, like not blurring that out. Yeah, so there's kind of a sort of sophistication of the humanist project kind of latent to that, and you know, things that like being free is probably actually quite a good thing on balance, and yes, it's contested and it should be, but design's role within that, I guess, is kind of highly variegated, because there's so many different things, ways in which it could apply. The obvious kind of iconic examples are things like the space program, or synthetic biology, or new agricultural production, and this kind of thing, which are all weighted with these other agendas, but that's precisely why I think they need to be engaged with on those terms, actually, you know, because they need to be subverted. And we'll be wrong. We'll probably also be successful. That's been the history of the last 2.4 million years, is that on balance we have survived and got ourselves into all kinds of trouble along the way. So you sort of hope that that continues. That was a very rambling answer, but...
It kind of makes me think about kind of, in a way, sort of really interlinked, highly sort of enmeshed, sort of pluralist kind of politics. Whereas I'm reading a book by Alberto Toscano where he's talking about fanaticism being a kind of real, very much kind of, real like, rupturous, rationality beyond rationality, because it's not something necessarily that we can actually necessarily that we can empathise with, because it's an idea that is beyond being able to be rationalised in a certain sense by Westerners, say, for example, in instances. So I wonder how that comes within the plot twist, because in a sense the plot twist is always premised on the fact that on my sphere of being able to look at it at any one time, from a sort of maybe I'm thinking of it. Maybe my problem is I'm thinking on a unitary standpoint, some one standpoint like that. That I'm the one person there, as opposed to a set of detectives.
Yeah, a collective yarn work. Yeah.
Where that we then will be able to somehow be able to pull in these external points within this sphere somehow. These ideas that can't be, or more of these ideas that can't be thought by one perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even with the thing about the adversity sophisticating the plot, it doesn't from the perspective of the protagonists, but as what I called a plot's eye view. It kind of having people trying to outdo each other in various ways or disrupt each other's plans actually means that the whole situation gets much more kind of complex. And I think those kinds of modes of collaboration are probably pretty important to attend to. And that's actually one thing that, like in a lot of leftist literature, you do have traces of this thing about kind of like fellowship, as expressed in sort of solidarity and this kind of thing. And then it becomes very difficult when you start to introduce things like identity politics into it and that sort of thing, because you get like multiplication of viewpoints and incommensurabilities and this sort of thing. And one of the reasons that the right has been so successful at the upper echelons of elite universities and so on, I think, is because if you read something like Hayek, and he's just kind of like, we just don't say what the ends are. It's all about means, and that's what capitalism is about and trade is about. It's just about means, and we're not going to say anything about ends. So if you don't want to just subscribe to that, then we need like a much more sophisticated understanding of how events can be collaborative and involve large groups of people according to some dynamic that isn't a simple kind of basically a with us or against us kind of position, but like actually that there are all kinds of agendas and the way they layer and the way they disrupt each other, which I think is... I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but there's the plot, the idea of the plot has like a valence to that, I think.
Because otherwise you're making a plan and then the plots are just going to come from elsewhere, which is precisely what happens. Yeah,
and like plans, it's historically, I mean, things like James C. Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, his book about planning, basically, and he's kind of right, and he points to stuff like the Greek concept of metos, kind of intelligence in that. Not in kind of maybe the richest sort of way, but, just the way that when people... especially people who already have a lot of authority to have their actions carried out in the world, will plan stuff out, and they take things as given. So you can plan stuff out, as in you write it on a piece of paper, and you list down some dependencies, and you expect it to work. And often, the fact that doesn't work instigates enormous amounts of violence, and kind of state-led protect, or any large actor, I guess, corporations and this sort of thing as well. When you're kind of like, well, the plan has to work, we work the plan out, it's perfectly rational. Maybe people aren't rational, maybe we should hit them with sticks until they just see the better, they see how good the plan is, the beatings will continue until the morale improves and all this kind of thing. Whereas plotting, brings like a totally different kind of aesthetic to that sort of thing. And it's
because it is about harnessing energy that's already there.
And you see that like in Nick and Alex's manifesto and their forthcoming book. They're talking about like a left accelerationist politics, which has been a very controversial proposition, but a big part of it is just that the left needs to build kind of ecosystems of different kinds of institutions, and it doesn't have to agree on everything.
Right.
And people can have different perspectives but still work together in this kind of thing, and that kind of like internecine disputes that are just a drain on that kind of thing, you know, and it's kind of there are undoubtedly certain sort of effective rewards to being right with someone in an argument with someone who believes nearly what you do, so you can be very discerning about what they're wrong about and what you're right about, that sort of thing. But, you know, like in the broader landscape, you know, that same kind of those same kinds of discussions don't scale up because they just sort of evaporate and no one can agree on what to do and this kind of thing. That's a scaling problem again. Yeah. Whereas the plotting thing is a bit more loose in its approach to kind of what's going to happen in the future. It doesn't, you know, try to articulate, or it doesn't imply the articulation of like a perfectly sketched future, but more just kind of the evolution of the plot. I don't know what you guys would.
Yeah.
You've certainly been in Botland.
Yeah, I've been in Botland. Yeah, I mean that's, and also I was just thinking about another big project which I talked about at the Art Academy. You were there and earlier in the week, and that was this project called Field Club, where I kind of like lived for a number of years on a tiny piece of land and tried to grow all my own food and tried to analyse it. So I had a plan. And it completely failed because the plot acted out on the plan, and it became about analysing what went wrong and why the plan wasn't achievable. So, that's. And I think in terms of like future design and where we're at, plotting is like massively more important, and but I mean it's pretty hard I think for humans to, in general, sort of like open ourselves to like things outside of ourselves that might affect our decisions, and so it's a long way to go I think before governments start plotting rather than planning.
But you do see now the building of platforms, governments and businesses and, you know, individuals as well. So rather than trying to articulate a fully fledged plan, like build some kind of platform that you think there's a good chance will be useful. I mean, Facebook have been very explicit about this and got laughed at a lot for it in the business press when they had the next billion users strategy, and they were just kind of this really intricate plan about getting the entirety of Africa online, basically via Facebook, which, aside from all kinds of issues that you might have with that, one of the things was people were just like, well, but where's the money going to come from? And they were like, well, we're going to have like another billion people using Facebook, so it will come from somewhere. And but it was very obvious in that they were valuing what they were doing in terms of just kind of like potential, kind of like you do something big enough and it will have effects that you can, I guess in their situation, you can kind of recapture. But even at a small level, that kind of like platform thinking rather than planning is, it's kind of interesting seeing it begin to work its way through into even things like activist groups talking about building platforms like Plan C in the UK and stuff like that. Where they're sort of like, we need to build an infrastructure here and we don't know what's going to happen on top of it, but we know it will be stuff that's different from now and possibly better. That's when the plot twist gets you, of course.
Okay. No. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes.